let me. Now is the record is working. So
But
let's
we
get
can
started.
take some minutes, no,
Okay,
Carlos,
perfect.
for
So
trying to expect the people
okay,
was
now
in the uh,
okay, we are 10 people right now. So and there are some people more coming. So
but
anyway,
Pablo is now
yeah,
in
Pablo is here.
Yeah,
perfect.
can you hear me all right?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah.
All right. It took me a
Hi,
while.
Pablo. How are you?
Hi everyone.
Hi.
Sorry, it turns out that there was an issue with my browser. So I was trying to get through Chrome, and I needed to change to Edge. I don't know why it was, but yeah. So it took me, and I need to uninstall the whole thing. So it took. The wonders of technology. At my university, we use Zoom all the time, so we are not prepared for
Which
Teams.
is better than Teams, by the way. So
fierce discussions about this these days.
Yeah, but I can't tell you, Zoom is the best one.
So we are now at my university. So I'm in the faculty council, and they want to change to Teams because apparently they offer a better deal.
Yeah.
So financially, it makes more. So the management is trying to push for Teams, and staff is trying to push back for Zoom. So it's like the new war these days.
That's why we have Teams, basically. So, well, anyway, Professor Thompson, Pablo del Hierro is a professor at Maastricht University, and he's introducing you. So, I don't know if you know each other. I don't think so. So
Right, sorry, I was just getting rid of something. Something keeps pinging at me, and I'm trying to work out what it is so we don't have any noise.
okay. So now is like 5:05. Should we get started, Miguel Ángel?
Yeah. Adelante.
Okay. So let's get started with this last session of our permanent seminar of the research group Post-Demap, Post-War, Authoritarianism and Democracy. Today we have with us Professor Helen Thompson. We really appreciate her to be here today. The presenter of her is going to be Pablo del Hierro, who is a professor at Maastricht University. So the seminar is going to work as usually. First, Pablo is going to introduce our guest. Then Professor Thompson will have about 40-45 minutes, whenever you want. And then there will be room for asking questions and debates about a fantastic book. So I suppose there will be so many questions. Please, Pablo, if you are right, please, let's get started.
Yes, thank you very much. So it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Helen Thompson, who is a professor of political economy and a fellow at Clare College, Cambridge, and currently a member of the Department of Politics and International Studies. Her current work is focused on the historical origins of the post-2008 economic and political world and the crisis that is generating for Western countries. More particularly, recent work covers the political economy of oil, Brexit, and the Eurozone crisis. I'm also like to highlight the public intellectual dimension, which I think is very prominent. She not only writes columns for the New Statesman, if I'm not incorrect, but also she co-hosts often the Talking Politics podcast with David Runciman. I think we are going to have a very lively presentation and afterwards conversation about a number of topics concerning geopolitics, concerning political economy, and also a little bit concerning the future of democracy. I think part of it is going to be around the latest book of Helen Thompson that I really enjoyed. And also also hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit. This is an audience mainly made of historians. So it would be nice also to hopefully to have a little bit of a talk about interdisciplinarity. I know that Carlos Domper is very much on top of the challenges of interdisciplinary work, of mixing different approaches and mixing very much disciplines. And I think this is what Helen Thompson did in her last book, which combines politics, economy, but also a little bit of history, or actually quite a big deal of history. And this is always, of course, this is always a challenge, which in this case, it paid out considerably. And okay, I'm already speaking too much. So without further ado, floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks very much, Pablo and Carlos, and I thank you very much for inviting me. Given the nature of my book Disorder, it's not very easy to give a straightforward talk about the book because it's rather ambitious, as those of you who've read it will realize, and I'm doing several different things in it. So I want to very quickly give a sense of the two big things that I was trying to do, and then I'm going to concentrate on a story really about one of them, focused around energy, because I think, well, let me say how I saw the book first of all, and then I hope you'll see what I mean in this respect. So what I wanted to do, the initial impulse in this sense for writing Disorder, was to try to give a long historical account of the political shocks of the 2010s. Obviously, at the center of that was Brexit and Trump in 2016. But if 2016 was the epicenter of the shocks, I also thought the failed coup in Turkey that year was a pretty important shock in some sense in its political significance, on a par with the other two. And I started in thinking about that from a desire to escape from too narrow academic, well, in some sense, as you said, and probably too narrow academic disciplinary approaches. And I wanted to, well, I thought it was important to connect the geopolitical to the macroeconomic and to democratic politics. And I thought that actually that was, being able to do that was central to being able to understand the nature of the political shocks of the 2010s, because of the way in which different crises were interacting with each other. And then, both separately and in conjunction with that, I wanted to try to explain the way in which I thought that fossil fuel energy, oil and gas in particular, oil over a longer history, was fundamental to being able to understand all this. And where the geopolitics was concerned, I would say is kind of near primary in my account. Where the economics is concerned, it's quite a lot, particularly when one then understands or thinks about the relationship between the energy realm and the monetary and financial realm. And then with what was happening in democracies, the energy story is less important. I spend a lot more time, for instance, on questions about the impact of the European Union on democratic politics in European democracies in the latter part of the book. But nonetheless, I don't think it's possible to understand what's been going on in American democracy since the 1970s without some element of an energy story to that too, because of the United States being such a significant energy producer, and then from the 70s having to adjust to being the world's largest oil importer. So an important part of my story of the 2010s was fossil fuel energy, and the dysfunctionality around fossil fuel energy is a significant part of the disruption of the 2010s. But I wouldn't want to suggest that it's anything like the only explanation. And I wouldn't have spent as much time on, for instance, the history of the relationship between democracy and nationhood if I thought that were the case. What I want to do in this talk is to concentrate on the energy aspect of it, and to try to give a little bit of sense of like the medium term long history, a little bit sense of even longer history, and just trying to suggest that actually the world in the 21st century, in that sense, the hard times of this century, is really bound up with the relationship between the existing fossil fuel energy status quo and a set of fault lines around that, and the energy transition and the relationship between the energy status quo, or what has been the energy status quo, and the energy transition. And I think the energy transition then has some quite profound implications for democratic politics, including for destabilizing democracies again. But I'm not going to talk about that in the main talk, but we can obviously talk about it in the conversation afterwards. So just as a framing to start, just to give you some sense of maybe like where I'm like positioning myself here, there's obviously been quite a lot of talk in the last, at least the last year, perhaps longer, of the poly crisis, and that's obviously a term that Adam Tooze has used a lot to frame his attempt to understand why the whole world in some sense is so prone to crisis at the moment. And I kind of basically go along with the idea that the world is facing multiple crises, and that those crises interact with each other and reinforce each other. But in a way, I think that my thesis in Disorder is that energy predicaments are the systemic cause of a significant number of the bits of the poly crisis, and in some sense that energy predicaments are the glue that puts the poly crisis together, and means that the interactive aspects of it take the form in which that they do. I'm going to divide what I'm going to say into like 4 main parts. First of all, I just want to say something about energy as an analytical issue, about thinking about it as an explanatory variable in geopolitics, and what it means to think about energy, or to give as much importance as I do to energy in my political economy story. And then I want to give an account of where we are now, that begins actually in the 1970s, to start with the 70s, to try and explain how I think that Western states got out of the 70s in the early part of the 80s, and that we went through then an interlude that came to an end in the early 2000s, and that there were 4 big structural forces all around energy that have shaped the century in which we're now living, and that if we don't understand them, we're going to struggle to understand the economic and the political world at the moment. And then I'm just going to draw some quick conclusions about why I think the importance of energy is going to endure. So just quickly, a little bit about where I'm coming from on the geopolitics question, or the relationship between geopolitics and energy. I think it's fair to say, that I come from an academic discipline, political science in the broadest sense, and I'm including international relations in that, and political economy, that, shall we say, generally people haven't taken energy very seriously. Let's leave it at that. And I think that that's particularly true, really, of the dominant theoretical perspectives on international politics. So within the international relations realism, which you might think would take energy seriously, given that it starts with security, but I don't think that it does. It really concentrates on military security. And liberalism, which, as we know, treats gives considerable explanatory value to economic interdependence, and wouldn't recognize energy as a specific kind of economic problem or having creating specific asymmetries in that interdependence. But I think that once you start looking at a history of the 20th century, then it's pretty difficult to uphold that notion that energy isn't really worthy of study, and not that it's not worthy of study, but that it's not a particularly important explanatory value. And in a way, what I wanted to do in the first part of disorder, so the geopolitical third, and the first 2 chapters of that, because each third's got 3 chapters organized by time, is to try in a way to race through 20th century geopolitical history and show how much of it becomes quite clear quite starkly if one looks at a set of dilemmas for states, particularly initially the European states, that arose in relation to the growing importance of oil as an energy source for military purposes at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, obviously, I could spend a lot of time on this, but I just, in one way, want to make this point quite simply. Obviously, the beginning of the 20th century was still a West European dominated world, the world of European empires. But as oil was beginning to transform the military world, because there was the prospect, which was materialized by like the 1910s, of oil-based navies, is European states, particularly I would say Britain, as the then dominant power, had a huge problem on their hands because Britain didn't have any domestic oil, and there wasn't much in the parts of the world that Britain ruled in its empire. And that was true of the other European states. The only European great power that had a domestic source of oil at that point was Austria, and it was underdeveloped and detached in terms of transportation from Austria's coast. The 2 big oil producers in the world at the beginning of the 20th century were the United States and Russia. And I don't think it's a coincidence at all that the 20th century was then dominated geopolitically by the United States, Russia, what became the Soviet Union. I think if you then take up the American story and understand that American domestic oil production pre-shale peaked in 1970, and that from 1970 onwards, the United States was on a fairly rapid trajectory to becoming the largest oil importer in the world, with a dependency upon the Middle East that had never historically had before, and that it was faced with that problem at the very moment that Britain was ending its empire in the Middle East and withdrawing militarily from east of Suez. There you have the origins of a great deal of the American Middle Eastern problem, ongoing to this day, compounded by the end of the 70s by the Iranian Revolution, because the American hope was that the Saudis and Iran could essentially do the work for the United States that Britain had supposedly been doing for West European countries where oil security was concerned. If we then think of a development right at the end of the 20th century, turn into this century, China's rise, China's economic development, a really crucial part of that is the fact that China, as its economic growth began to really take off in the 90s, had moved into itself being an oil importer. So China's oil self-sufficiency ended in 1993. By 2017, China had overtaken the United States as the world's largest oil importer. That poses a set of issues for China around energy security in a world dominated by American naval power, in which the Americans could blockade the Strait of Malacca for most consequentially, and cut China off from oil and gas imports from the Middle East and Africa. And I think you can understand the quite a lot about China's Eurasian turn, particularly under Xi Jinping, by understanding the desire the Chinese leadership has had since the very beginning of this century to find a way to break that potential stranglehold that the United States Navy has over China's foreign energy supply. So there's a lot of things I think probably in my telling of geopolitical history of the 20th century that oversimplify. Nonetheless, I think that in trying to explain so much of it by oil, there's actually a clarity that comes to that, and we can see things in different lights than we would otherwise. And I could say something if we want in conversation about the way I think that it allows one to see a kind of continuous problem that Germany has in relation to Russia through the 20th century and into this century. So something then about energy and macroeconomy, or energy and political economy. I mean, I'm not an economist, and I don't think I've ever really thought in the way in which economists do about this, but it's pretty clear that some of this economists think the dominant way of thinking within economics about how to conceive what economies are has been inherited by people who work within political economy, I think. And that is to emphasize money as an analytical category and a way of conceiving what an economy is and the way of measuring what's going on, and not energy. So that conceptually economists treat energy as subordinate to money. The concepts of economics come from the money side of the economy. They don't come from the energy side of the economy. Yet this is despite the fact that all economic activity requires the application of energy, and the use of energy is subject to the laws of physics, to which money's got no relevance. I think if we then start to think historically, particularly over the last 50 years, we can see that the big monetary junctures that we think about, like the end of Bretton Woods, the beginnings of financial liberalization in the 1970s, the period of low inflation from like the 80s, the middle of the 80s, let's say, really through to the early 2000s, the 2008 crash, and where we are now in terms of central banks dealing with energy-driven inflation with monetary tightening, and really, in some sense, an end to the post-2008 monetary environment, that the energy junctures and the monetary junctures go together, and that shouldn't surprise us when we understand the centrality of energy to the way in which economies work. So let me turn then to the 1970s and my reading, if you like, of the 70s crisis and what the relationship is between the 70s energy crises and where we are now. And as I say, where I'm moving, what I want to say here is that in some sense, energy crises since the 70s is more the norm. The period when they weren't there is the interlude. That it doesn't mean to say that I think we're going back to the 1970s. I think things are actually a lot more complicated now than they were in the 70s. But nonetheless, I don't think that we can understand where we are now without running a continuous story from the 70s that then recognizes the interlude in the middle. So I think there were a series of geopolitical shocks around energy in the 70s. The first of them, in some sense, I think is often the least commented upon, was that the 70s was a really poor decade compared to what had gone before, where oil discoveries were concerned. That from the late 60s onwards, there was a significant fall in the rate of oil discoveries, such that if you leave shale out of it, the world basically has been largely getting by on the same large oil fields that had been discovered by the end of the 1960s. And I'm putting it at the late 1960s because that allows us to include West Siberia into that. Secondly, as I've already said, US domestic oil production peaked in 1970. Didn't reach the same level again until 2017, 2018, maybe. And whilst the US had never been entirely self-sufficient where oil was concerned, it had largely been self-sufficient where oil was concerned. And then the problem for the United States in the 70s was that it very rapidly, given the fact that it was by far the largest oil consumer in the world, had to adjust to buying millions of barrels a day from abroad, and that would include from the Middle East. And as I've already said, then the United States had to do that, adjust to this new world at the same time as the British were withdrawing from the Middle East. So in the post-war period, effectively, the United States had encouraged Britain, and Britain had accepted for its own sake, the role of acting as the Western military guarantor of Western European oil interests in the Middle East. Now, it absolutely had not always succeeded at that. Think about the Suez crisis, but that was the role that Britain took for itself, and that the Americans wanted Britain to play as well. But when the Americans themselves were in the position now of needing oil security in the Middle East, the British were not in a position to provide it. The Johnson administration had begged the Wilson government in Britain to stay, and Britain no longer had a strong enough currency in order to make those kind of military commitments abroad. Fourth shock came from the Soviet side because of these discoveries in West Siberia that were clear, the volume of them, by the late 1960s. And that allowed the Soviet Union significantly to increase both oil and gas production, and to become an exporter, a much significantly larger exporter of oil, and a significant exporter of gas to Europe, as we know, including to Germany. And that the Soviet leadership in 1970s used the Soviets' position as, for a while, well, for quite some while, for more than a decade actually, being the largest oil producer in the world and the significant exporter of oil and gas, to allow the Soviet Union to import food from abroad. And that was a trade that was effectively meant using export revenues to buy food from Western countries. Now that would in the end prove to be a significant liability for the Soviet Union. And I'll come to that. But if we just keep going with the shocks of the 70s for the moment, I think I'm on fifth now. The fifth one is the rise of OPEC, and we can see that obviously most clearly in the Yom Kippur War of 1973-74, when OPEC collectively cut oil production drastically, leading to about a 350% increase in the price of oil in about a 6-month period. And the Arab members of OPEC also embargoed the sale of oil to those countries that were supporting Israel actively. So that was the United States and Netherlands. And this was the first time that OPEC had really been able to use oil and an oil embargo and oil prices as a geopolitical weapon. There'd been some attempt to do it in the 1967 Arab-Israeli war, but nowhere near as effectively as this. And this meant that the United States was simultaneously going to rely on Saudi Arabia to act as, initially with Iran until the Iranian Revolution, a guarantor of American oil security in the Middle East. And yet at the same time, Saudi Arabia was the leader of an oil cartel that had the capacity to inflict further oil price shocks on the United States. And the final thing I would say about the 70s is, and it's not quite a shock in the same way, but I think it's important to understand, is that at the end of the decade, China under Deng Xiaoping made that turn to economic reform and to basically pursuing industrialization within the context of integration into the trade side, at least, of the world economy. And although China did that at a point in which China was self-sufficient in oil, Mao had developed the Chinese oil industry like in the 1950s. Deng, I think, was already thinking ahead, and he saw that there was going to be a point in which rising Chinese energy consumption, given the size of China's population, was going to cause China itself some difficulties. And I don't think it's a coincidence then that hand in hand with Deng's economic reforms in 1979 went the one-child policy, that there was a clear link that Deng made between the problem of China's economic development and the resource constraints it might run into if its population continued to rise in the rate in which it had done during the 1960s. So they're the things I'm going to present as like the geopolitical like shocks of the decade. And as we know, there was considerable economic fallout from these shocks. So I just want to run through a little bit about that and then say how I see this era of the 70s energy crises around oil coming to an end and what the economic and geopolitical implications of that were. So first thing I want to stress is that I think that there's a clear link between the end of American oil self-sufficiency and the end of Bretton Woods and the beginnings of financial liberalization. So Bretton Woods had been set up in 1944 in a world in which the United States had a trade surplus. And part of the reason why the United States had a trade surplus was because it didn't have to burden its trade, its current account, with the problem of financing oil imports in a way which, say, Britain, France, West Germany had to do. By the time we get to the early 1970s, the United States, in having a need to import oil, or the volume in which it did, was going to land itself with a structural trade deficit that it then had to finance. Now, I don't think Bretton Woods, which had been based on the idea that the US would have a trade surplus, could keep working in a world in which the United States had a structural trade deficit. But it was also the case that the way in which the United States wanted to finance that was to be able to borrow in open international capital markets, not to adjust its domestic economy to this new need to import oil, but to open the United States more to international capital. So I think that we can explain quite a bit of the motivation for the turn towards financial liberalization led by the US in the 70s by the oil problem that the United States faced. Separately from the problem of America now importing oil was the oil price shocks themselves, the first, the 1973 one, and then repeated again in 1978-79 after the Iranian Revolution. And as we know, particularly actually the second one, caused that phenomenon that gets now described as stagflation. So rising inflation, rising unemployment, and low growth at the same time. And what we can see through the 70s is that the ways in which governments, and to some extent corporations, I would say, dealt with these blows was to turn to debt. So household debt, so household budgets were cushioned by the growth of household debt. Government budgets, in terms of dealing with rising demands on the welfare state, including obviously unemployment benefit, were dealt with by borrowing more in international capital markets. So the era of balanced budgets was out. For a while, those developing countries that were commodity exporters were able to go back to borrowing in international capital markets, which they'd really been shut out of since the 1930s, because now commodity prices were high on the back of oil prices. But into this came the worry at the US Federal Reserve, once Paul Volcker had taken over, that there was too much debt, too much inflation, and nobody was really doing anything to stop either of those dynamics. Now, I think that the story of the Volcker shock, as it sometimes gets called, whereby it is Volcker's willingness to impose high unemployment, not just on the United States, but on European economies, to push the developing countries that had been, particularly the commodity exporters that had been borrowing in international capital markets, into debt crises. The debt crisis, obviously, for developing countries, beginning with Mexico, like in 1982. If you take energy out of the picture, this story is usually told as a kind of ideological turn led by Volcker, encouraged in Britain once Margaret Thatcher's government came to office in 1979, taken up even further in the United States when Reagan won in 1980. And obviously we know the name that often gets like put on this turn then becomes the neoliberal term, not a term that Volcker himself would like ever have used. And then the story goes on that this squeezing inflation out of the economy at the expense of high unemployment in Western countries and the debt crisis in developing countries creates what we would think of as the globalized economy, international economy of the 1990s, with all that emphasis like on low inflation, central bank independence. But I don't think that's quite the right way to think about what was happening. I think if you introduce energy into this story, we see something rather different, and that actually that what Volcker's approach did in essentially crushing economic growth really was to set energy demand lower until the very high prices that the oil price shocks of the 70s had yielded made it profitable for oil companies to extract more difficult oil, usually offshore oil, most consequentially in Alaska and in the North Sea in Mexico offshore. So this is where the story about the fact that the oil discoveries outside Western Siberia had fallen off by the 60s mattered, because the 70s was looking at a decade in which the oil that was there to be extracted was going to cost quite a lot more to extract because it was offshore. And so actually, in order to get out of the oil problems of the 70s, then high oil prices were necessary, because high oil prices made it possible for BP and American companies to think that it was worth it to do offshore exploration and offshore extraction. So in that sense, I think that kind of the Volcker shock kind of like reset energy demand lower, bought time for the new oil supply to come into the markets, and then it's that more plentiful supply of oil that brings inflation back down. So we see inflation come down when oil prices come down, essentially. And obviously this has a very advantageous consequences for Western countries, because instead of that new oil supply coming out of the Middle East or out of the Soviet Union, it's coming out of either Western countries themselves, Britain and the United States, or a country that's less problematic geopolitically, Mexico. And meanwhile, the developing country debt crisis has also eased things off considerably, because instead of having a decade of instead of the 1980s being a decade of development where developing countries' aspiration for higher growth is really fulfilled, which would have brought about a big increase in the demand for oil, that isn't what happens in the 80s and going into the 90s. It's a decade of lost development. There were, I think, then several geopolitical consequences of all this. The first of them is that the rise of this new offshore supply and the fall in oil prices really caused, in different ways, the two big oil producers in the world of the time, Saudi Arabia and the Soviet Union, serious problems. And Saudi Arabia's response to that made the Soviet Union's worse, because being confronted with this new supply and the fall in prices and the realization that OPEC could not use oil prices as a geopolitical weapon, like, say, over the Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, where there was no OPEC real response to that, led the Saudis by the middle of the 1980s to concentrate on competing for market share. That meant that they were going to sell oil as cheaply as possible. And that meant that the oil price crashed in 1986, and that had devastating consequences for the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was still stuck with needing those export revenues from energy to pay for its still burgeoning food import bill, and it no longer had them, and it needed credit from Western countries, Western creditors, private and official, in order to deal with that problem. Its fiscal position deteriorated rapidly. I think that's quite central to why Gorbachev pulled Soviet troops out of Afghanistan in 1987. And whilst I wouldn't want to suggest that the oil price crash was the primary cause of the end of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe or the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, I think the Soviet demise on both counts was accelerated, at the very least, by the huge hit that it took from the Saudi decision to crash oil prices in 1986. Well, then, about the 2000s, why is the 2000s really quite a juncture? I think what we need to see here is that there are four different, what I'm going to call, structural forces around energy have been at work really since the beginning of the decade. Though in terms of the energy transition, which I want to treat as the fourth, I'm going to just backtrack a little bit into the 90s for a Germany story with that, partly because of something I want to say later. So let's start with the first, which I think is rising Asian energy consumption. Now, in a way, the spectre of this had hung over the 70s. If you go back and say, like, well, why were many Western politicians, many people in the think tank, if you can call it that, world of the 70s, so worried about growth prospects in the 70s? What was behind, for instance, the Limits to Growth report published by the Club of Rome in 1972? I think at the heart of it was a fear that Asian resource consumption was going to threaten the living standards of Western countries, particularly when they looked at population growth in China and India in the post-war period. And I've said, for various reasons, that turned out not to be the story of the 80s and 90s on a number of fronts. But rising Asian energy consumption has turned out to be the story of this century. And there are each of the three fossil fuel stories, I think, matter here, but in different ways. Let's start with oil. And as I've already said, China stopped being self-sufficient in oil in 1993. China's growth then is quite impressive in the rest of the 90s, but it's really spectacular in the first 7 or 8 years of the 2000s. So from the point in which China normalizes trade relations with the United States as a prelude to joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, China's oil consumption really takes off in relation to, in parallel with China's China's growth. India's oil consumption is also accelerating during the early 2000s, not obviously on the same scale. Now, I'm going to save what the price effects of that were for a moment to the next force, structural force I want to discuss, because it's the interaction that's crucial here. Let's turn then to coal. Coal was actually by far the most important energy source for China during those years of spectacular economic development. And that meant that quite quickly, in the middle of the 2000s, the entire international politics, international diplomacy of climate change was changed. Because in 2006, China took over from the United States as the largest carbon emitter in the world. So if you go back to the Kyoto Protocol, China could still be treated as not particularly important there. By the time we get to the Copenhagen summit in 2009, the idea that China is sort of slightly to the side of the climate change question is completely out of the window. Now there can be no international agreements that are going to have any effect whatsoever unless China is party to them. On gas, it takes a while longer for China's gas consumption really to start increasing so rapidly. That really happens around 2016. We can see China's demand for gas imports rising. And then in 2021, so the year before Russia's war started, China's demand for liquid natural gas imports, so that's seaborne gas, increased by at least 15% and perhaps a little bit more than that. Now, what we can see then in the second half of 2021, before the Omicron variant of COVID hit, was that European and Asian countries experienced a profound gas price shock. If you look at, what happens to the gas prices, let's just keep to Europe, there's a really sharp increase that goes through the second half of 2021. And what we can see from this point, and obviously this continues into the war years, is a really quite tight competition between European countries and Asian countries for supply. And what has happened since the 24th of February of last year is that European countries that obviously now want even more liquid natural gas than they did before have really been pricing the poorer Asian countries, most notably Pakistan, out of these liquid natural gas markets. So Pakistan actually has ended up with pretty much no liquid natural gas imports, or virtually none, despite the fact Pakistan had long-term contracts with liquid natural gas companies to supply it. Germany, as we know, when the war began, didn't even have any liquid natural gas ports, let alone any contracts with anybody. But under this incredibly now tight competition for supply, it's been worth it for the companies to break the contracts with Pakistan, pay the penalties, and sell in the spot market to Europe. What we don't know yet is how China is really adjusting to this, because China's demand for gas imports also fell considerably last year. It's not so clear that China's got priced out of it as to whether China is actually thinking, if this is the way things are now, in terms of the structural Eurasian competition for supply, whether that they don't need either to use more domestically produced gas, and there is some potential for shale gas in China, or move away from such a transition to gas and the generation of electricity and burn more coal. Second big structural force is as I see it in the 21st century around energy, is the stagnation of conventional oil production. Now, when the stagnation began, I could have said, which was 2005, I could have just said the stagnation of oil production. So conventional oil production is oil production minus shale and minus tar sands. Tar sands is largely Canada, shale almost entirely the United States. what we can see in 2005 is, remember that this is a time when Asian demand is growing quite rapidly, is that oil production falls slightly and it doesn't recover again if we take shale, and it doesn't really recover again if we take shale and tar sands out of it onto an upward trajectory. I think 1 year in the 2010s it goes higher than it was in 2005 or 6, but I think it's only 1 year, and there were multiple reasons for that. Some of it was the fact that the world, as I already said, had been reliant on aging large fields, including the big Saudi fields, Ghawar in particular. It was also because of political instability in a number of oil-producing countries like Venezuela and Nigeria, and the great hope the Americans had that if you got rid of Saddam, that Iraq could quite quickly become a large-scale oil producer. Obviously didn't materialize. So what we see from 2005 is stagnant supply and then this rising demand out of Asia. And unsurprisingly, the effect of this is a huge oil price shock, particularly in 2008, the first half of 2008. So in the middle of 2008, when it reached its peak, oil was $150 a barrel at prices that was at 2008 prices, by far the highest level that oil prices have ever been. And I don't think that the 2008 shocks, economic crisis, economic crash can really be separated out from the oil aspects of it. Not that there wasn't a financial crisis going on as well, but the ways in which the central banks dealt with the inflationary fears they had from oil price played its part in the financial crisis of 2008. What we've seen since then is basically that the world got by, in the world economy, I should say, got by in the 2010s on shale oil. And shale oil was dependent on a period of sustained high prices, 2011, 12, 13, and the monetary environment that came out of 2008, i.e. zero interest rates, quantitative easing. Because what the shale companies were able to do was to issue debt as junk bonds, i.e. a higher rate of return, at a time when investors were desperate to find some return on anything, and were willing really to turn a blind eye to the fact that shale wasn't very profitable for quite a lot of the time. So in that sense, macroeconomically, the world economy needed shale oil, and shale oil needed the dysfunctional monetary and financial environment that came out of 2008. If we turn the table, though, and think geopolitically about this, shale boom was incredibly geopolitically disruptive. On the oil side, it meant that the United States was now, or was by the middle of the decade, the largest oil producer in the world again. That was a big shock for the Saudis. Initially, the Saudis responded by trying to bankrupt the US shale industry, basically making the same move they'd made in the middle of the 1980s, but it didn't work. And in the wake of their failure, this time they had to, for the first time, reach an accommodation with Russia. And that, late 2016, after the Saudis had accepted they couldn't bankrupt the US shale industry, was the origins of OPEC Plus. So basically, for the first time now, we have Saudis and the Russians coordinating production quotas in order to try to manage the price. Now, I'd say for the rest of the 2010s, that was all that they could really do, was put a floor under the price after what the Saudis had done in crashing it. But what we've seen since the pandemic recovery began, so really since the summer of 2021, is that OPEC Plus really matters in terms of how much oil supply there is in the world, because the US shale boom can no longer compensate for the stagnation of conventional production. The US shale boom is far from over. but it's quite reliant now on one big field, the Permian Basin in Texas and New Mexico. And we can see, if we look what happened last year, that even in a world in which China's demand for oil was really quite weak because of zero COVID policies that were still in place in China for most of last year, because of the effects of the Chinese property crisis on China's economy, still, in order to keep the price of oil at levels that both Biden and Trump previously deemed intolerable, i.e. in the range of $70 a barrel, the United States has had to release a lot of oil on a daily basis from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Third is what Russia has done under Putin with energy. Now, I think it is fairly clear that Putin, right from the start, understood that energy and the likelihood of strong Chinese demand for oil in particular was going to be Russia's way back to being a great power again after the humiliations of the 1990s. And in that sense, the corollary of that big surge in the price of oil in the 2000s, or building up to 2008, caused by China's demand and stagnating conventional oil, was the means by which Russia could accumulate so much revenue into its fiscal coffers that it could pay the debt back to the IMF, basically start asserting an independent foreign policy. Again, I think that we can see, and I'm going to spend time on this, but we can talk about it in the conversation. We can see as well that Putin understood, in fact, actually his predecessors understood as well this, that energy could be a geopolitical weapon for controlling the post-Soviet space. So putting pressure on Ukraine at various points, including when it looked like Ukraine was wanting to undo or end the treaty that gives Russia use of Sevastopol, that an energy deal was done where basically the Ukrainians were told, you can have much reduced gas prices if you let us keep having Sevastopol. But what we can see, I think, then since Crimea is how resilient really Russia as an energy power is. Because if you compare like 2014, 2015 with like 1985, 1986, that blow that occurred to the Soviet Union when Saudis crashed the price then did not repeat in 2014-15 when the Saudis were crashing the price at a time when Russia was under sanctions because of the Crimea annexation. And one of the reasons why was because Putin had quite deliberately turned Russia into an agricultural food exporter. It wasn't just that he ended Russia's import food dependency. He actually turned Russia into an agricultural exporter as well. And now we can see under the war conditions that allows Russia to keep a coalition of states outside Europe and North America that have a very strong interest in continuing trade with Russia, not just on the energy side, but on the food side too. And I think that it's important to see that really what has happened since the war began is that Russia's trade in energy has been geographically reconfigured towards Asia more than it's really taken a hit on its energy power. Okay, climate change and the energy transition. Now, this way I just want to skip very quickly, like back into the 1990s before telling this story, because here I think it's clear that Germany is a medium-sized power, committed in the 90s to an energy transition, the energy transition before any other medium-sized power or large power did. And it did so for reasons, I think, that weren't just to do with climate change, but were to do with how aware German policymakers are of Germany's energy vulnerabilities. Because if there was a way out of the 70s problems for Britain and the United States with new oil supplies, that obviously was not the German story. But what we've seen, I think, in the 2000s, in this century, is not only have pretty much everybody else joined we need to do the energy transition, though obviously with perhaps different degrees of commitment in the United States, depending on who's been in the White House. But from a moment in 2015, the energy transition, I think, has become itself a site of geopolitical conflict and tension. And I think the turning point here was Made in China 2025, which was issued by the Chinese leadership, as a strategy issued by the Chinese leadership in a plan in 2015. And it made it pretty clear that China intended, and already in some sense was, dominating the supply chains, not only around metals, not only around the manufacturing of low carbon infrastructure like solar panels, but also intended to dominate electric vehicle production and the supply chains around electric vehicle production. And I think that the Trump presidency in regard to China, the Inflation Reduction Act last year, should be understood as American reaction to that. And a real fear, particularly I think after Biden came in, that in the same way in which the United States had dominated the age of oil geopolitically, that China was going to dominate, or is going to dominate, the age of low carbon energy. Now, I think that's in itself like an oversimplification. It presumes the energy transition is going to be more quick than I think that it's going to be. Nonetheless, I think if we want to try to understand the way in which American policymakers view the world, we need to understand the fear that they have about the geopolitical implications of the energy transition, particularly perhaps in regard to metals and China's dominance of metals, because the United States is already dependent upon metals from China. Okay, just a few then final thoughts, because I'm aware of time, is that I think that it's clear in a way that the energy transition and the net zero actually, in some sense, became for Western policy makers, a policy for dealing with the poly crisis, if you like. That it was a way, it's become a way of like trying to solve a lot of different things at the same time, of reducing geopolitical energy vulnerability, because even if you've got to depend on the metals from abroad for European countries, that you will still be domestically producing the energy itself. That it's become a way of trying to deal with or trying to have higher growth, and a way of dealing with the difficult political consequences of allowing offshoring of manufacturing to China and trying to claim it back again. Now, whether it's possible for the United States and then individual European countries all to do this at the same time, I've got grave doubts about that. It seems the United States have got all the advantages there, but I think that a huge amount politically is being invested in the energy transition as a way of dealing with the poly crisis. I think that the problems of fossil fuel energy, both economically and geopolitically, are here to stay for some time to come. That isn't because the energy transition isn't going to happen or isn't happening. It's because the energy transition is going to happen like slowly. And all the progress really so far has come from decarbonisation of electricity. But decisive success can only come when we've talking about almost certainly the electrification of transportation and industry, though some people would say that hydrogen is going to do some of the work in that respect. So we're going to have increased geopolitical tension around metals that is going to come from pushing ahead with the things that we can do, decarbonising electricity, and any quick breakthroughs that occur elsewhere. But so we're going to have that geopolitics. But because the energy transition is going to be slow in relation to transportation and industry, then the demand for oil, gas, and to some extent coal as well isn't going away. And that I think that in the same way, well, I'm going to put this last point slightly differently. I think that we're heading for a world of multiple conflicts around energy, including outright resource conflict, because we're living in a multiple energy source world. So if we think that, as I do, that oil is pretty determinant of 20th century geopolitical history, and we're living in a world in which oil is going to be important, gas is going to be important, even to some extent coal is going to be important, nuclear power is going to be important, and that means like uranium. Metals are going to be important because of wind and solar. We're going to be living in a much more complicated geopolitical world, and we need to try and understand like what the interactions are between the different geopolitical fault lines in play. And I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Helen Thompson, for such a fantastic sum up of your book and for keeping to time so strictly. So we really appreciate you doing so. Now it's time for questions. We have some minutes because the seminar is supposed to be finished at 7. So we have some time for questions. There is any question? Somebody? Okay, Pablo, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for the talk. Fascinating. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you explained so eloquently, I think the first part of your book, to actually go into the last part of the book, which is something that I found particularly fascinating, and the way you did it, it's so sophisticated, and how you managed to merge all this story about oil to then the story about economy and finances to then finalize with the part of politics. And since we also have here quite a few experts on democracy, I particularly like this bit, and I wrote it down, how you talk about dependence on oil and the international capital markets in the 1970s, especially after the oil shock, constrain more and more political choices of domestic governments and undermine democratic accountability. And you show this very nicely with the example of the United States and how actually Roosevelt had managed to adapt democracy to different economic circumstances and geopolitical circumstances. How basically democracies had a room for maneuver up until the 1970s, that after the 1970s is increasingly narrowing down. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about this to the audience of historians of democracy, and also I was wondering because what some of our colleagues have shown here is how especially in continental Europe after 1945 you have very big discussions about what type of democracy should be, or what type of the democratic system should be implemented in Europe after the war. And I think Martin Conway was the one that came up with this term of contested democracies, right? Or contested democratic project. No, there's not the idea of one type of democracy, but there are different types of democracies on the table. And there's also this notion that it takes actually a little bit of time for the democratic system, the way actually Europeans or continental Europeans like to think about, to consolidate. And this is largely in the mid 1950s, when the big choices, also the Treaty of Rome is signed, and also you have in France, for instance, the Compact of de Gaulle and the Fifth Republic, which you also discuss in your book. So I was wondering, isn't this also like a crucial moment for that democratic sort of system to be ingrained and be actually less movable, less maneuverable already in the 1950s, when all these discussions kind of coalesce in European integration process on the one hand, Fifth Republic in France, all these sort of things. Thanks anyway.
Yeah, I think that there's I think in a way that these questions are like related to each other, because I think that what Roosevelt showed is that it was possible in a democracy to use, or to focus on a national economic project, like in what he once called the New Deal, and make that national economic project, or makes the wrong word, protect in some sense that national economic project from the forces of the international economy. And then that's why I want to stress quite a bit that I think that there's quite a strong anti-international finance aspect to the New Deal. And Roosevelt's rhetoric on this, or language on this, including in his first inaugural address, is not coincidental, in that respect. That he's kind of pushing a line that says that there's a profound tension between democracy and international finance, and that in the moment of crisis, it has to be democracy and not international finance. Now, what he does with that notion of economic nationhood, as I'd call it, in the US, immediately we've got to put some caveats into that, because it's a very racialized version of economic nationhood with the New Deal. It's for white Americans, and it shuts African Americans out of it. But the idea behind it doesn't have to be racialized, and I think that's the idea that takes hold. In a way, they've tried to do it themselves, but less successfully, perhaps in the 20s. But in European states after that, actually, there will be national economic projects, and that some of that will be about the welfare state, some of that will be about full employment, some of that will be about the state backing, like national champions and big technological projects, and that those things will stabilize democracies. Now, I think two different things on the question of the contested democratic projects. In a way, that relationship between having a national economy that's in some sense protected from the world economy by the institutions of Bretton Woods, including the use of capital controls, allows a space for there to be a contest about democracy. It allows there to be, is it Christian democracy? Is it social democracy? And that's particularly important, I think, for any democratic project that's got social democracy at its centre, because that's what looked in the 1920s and the early 1930s as if it wasn't really compatible with a finance-centric, an open financial, essentially an international economy that was open on the financial side. And in that sense, if you take Keynes as a kind of important character in this story because of his role in Bretton Woods, I think he quite self-consciously thought that what you did with a restrictive international financial order was allow a space for democratic political contest. You could have a debate then in a country's politics about whether it was going to be democracy to the left, democracy to the right. Now, I think though, moving from the general about Western Europe to some things a bit more particular, if you then look at the story of the individual big West European democracies in the post-war era, something quite different is going on in each of them that's a bit separated out from these questions. And in France's case, I think because of the conjunction of the divisions within France over the war experience, plus the fact that France was willing to use war to hold on to its empire, particularly obviously in Algeria for like as long as possible, that you had some contest about the legitimacy of democracy within not just the political elite but the military too. And that is the context in which de Gaulle can really come to power by a coup in the first place, and then can be threatened by a number of coups like during the 1960s. So I think though, in the case of Britain, it's a bit different, because the difficult question that British, I think, democracy in retrospect has to wrestle with through those decades, and will take all the way till 2016 and Brexit really to like play itself out, like is the way that democracy is constitutionally organized in Britain, is that compatible with joining a supranational, first economic then political community of the kind that was the European Economic Community and then the European Union? And I think that the answer to that's been like, well, it was pretty hard, and that it's not just that actually there were things about the way in which British democracy constitutionally worked that weren't very easy to reconcile with the way in which the European Union was going to work, and that way of doing democracy, which is, I think, at its centre probably quite German, post-war Germany, I mean by that, where you constitutionalize a lot of questions and you take them out of democratic politics, and that you don't allow democratic contest. That was quite hard, I think, to render compatible with the way to render compatible with British democracy. And so what then looked like a kind of because we have democratic stability, it's the post-war years, that idea that there was democratic stability, we just do the things that are economically advantageous, more economic integration with the countries that we do the most trade, like Europe. Actually, it turned out that there was a quite complicated relationship between democracy and that European project. And although I think that there are issues for every democracy of the member states of the European Union, I think it turned out there were particular ones for Britain because of the in some sense the oddity of Britain's constitutional arrangements.
Okay, thank you so much. Any more questions? Anyone would like to? Okay, Miguel Ángel.
Yeah. Congratulations for your splendid, very interesting talk. My question is about the relevance, the influence of the 70s crisis, the 70 energy crisis, in the destruction or in the debilitation of the Keynesian paradigm. In the first decades, the glorious decades, the Keynesian way of of life, of economy, of see the politics is the main idea. But do you think is the key question the energy crisis for explain the destruction or the end of this kind of Keynesian paradigm, because it's not only a question of economics, but it's too a political question, because the social democracy and the idea of the power of left to integrate the middle class and the low level of the people with low income is very important. And then in the 80s is the triumph of the neoliberal or the Reaganomics, the Thatcher ideas. And do you think the crisis of the energy crisis is the key question, or there is only one aspect of this debilitation of Keynesianism?
I think this is a really interesting and really important question. I think that there is no doubt that the 70s energy crisis discredited intellectually aspects of Keynesianism. And I think that was because I'm not sure that Keynes would have signed up to this himself, but perhaps he would. But that idea of the Phillips curve that took hold, where basically governments could determine where they wanted to be, trading off inflation against unemployment. And so that you had more demand in the economy and you had higher inflation but lower unemployment, and vice versa. Once you've got inflation that's coming from energy, it's not at all difficult to explain why you're getting rising inflation and rising unemployment at the same time. But if you start from the Phillips curve, you logically can't have rising inflation and rising unemployment at the same time. So I think that's reflective. That problem for Keynesianism was reflective of the fact of something I said right at the beginning, of the fact that economists haven't taken any energy anywhere near sufficiently seriously, and a Keynesianism that had taken energy seriously wouldn't have got into that kind of mess, intellectual mess, because it wouldn't have been taken aback by what happened if you had an energy price shock. They wouldn't have thought that, well, you just treat energy like any other factor, and that it will rise and fall. Supply and demand will balance themselves out. I think that beyond that, there is a way in which that the energy crisis is central to the rise of what then gets called neoliberalism, or just a reaction against Keynesianism and reaction against the state. But it's not quite the way I think the story is often told. So I think that in order to see this, we need to think about what happened in the United States very specifically. So as the American oil position deteriorated, and I mean by that they needed to import significantly more from abroad, and that the Texas Railroad Commission, which had basically been controlling de facto prices when America was domestically self-sufficient, could no longer set prices in the same way, and oil prices were going up. So this is even before the oil price shock of 73. What the Nixon administration did was to put in place a very elaborate apparatus, both of price controls and of controlling who was producing what for which market within the United States. So, and who could buy what. So it would be okay, from, let's just say, New Mexico will be, exporting within the United States this amount of oil for heating purposes to Massachusetts, this amount for gasoline, etc. It was an incredibly elaborate apparatus, both of price controls and of production controls, that were put in place by the federal government. Because in a way, that's what the Texas Railroad Commission had done on a much more informal basis. So you create a huge federal apparatus to deal with the American oil problem, And then you have the people who will get called neoliberal, including like Milton Friedman, who will say, look, this is madness, that if the federal government wasn't trying to control everything and would just let prices take care of the problem, i.e. let oil prices rise, and then it would be possible to drill for more expensive oil, and then we'll have more supply and then prices will come down. That, I think, worked as an argument very persuasively because there was some truth to that. And even Carter, who generally wanted a politics as well in which energy consumption came down, he still got rid of quite a number of those federal controls that Nixon administration had put in place. I think if you then look in Britain and you say, well, what was going on in Britain was North Sea oil. It was complicated for the British government because a lot of the oil was in Scottish waters, and you had the Scottish nationalists making the claim that that meant it was Scotland's and not Britain's. And I think the last thing that any of the governments really, but particularly the Thatcher government perhaps, wanted was to have the British state highly involved in the North Sea oil industry, and then that adding fuel to the fire, so to speak, for the Scottish nationalists, because then you'd have a contested politics about who was controlling the oil industry. And so I think in the British case, there was a separate reason for like wanting a kind of market approach to being a newfound oil producer because of the territorial politics aspect to it. So in that sense, I don't think it's at all surprising, really, that the Americans and the British are the ones who are most associated with the neoliberal turn, because I think that but I don't think it's so much like as much ideology as I think it's got its origins in the very specific set of conditions that each of those two states faced in the 70s around energy.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Andres, I think it's your time.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Thompson, for this wonderful presentation. I was wondering about, again, your point about economists and, to some extent, political scientists not taking energy seriously. And I was wondering because you have said that this traditional story of from the 70s, this idea of neoliberalism, the traditional story of the Volcker shock and all that is not enough. But I was wondering if this lack of this notion that economists and political scientists don't take energy seriously has to do with the fact that, as you have, I think, repeatedly stressed, energy is very geopolitical, and therefore it clashes with these neoliberal notions of the global economy as like very insulated from politics, or trying to insulate the global economy from politics. And I think with energy you cannot really do that, or it's very difficult to do that because it has all these, as you have shown, these geopolitical dimensions. And therefore I'm wondering if you think that maybe this uncomfortable treatment of energy by professional economists has something to do with at least with ideology, in the sense that whereas, as you mentioned, money, you can construct these theories of money that are you can really insulate money or central banks from politics, or at least you can build theories around that. Whereas with energy, you cannot really, at least to my knowledge, you cannot really make such a strong case of trying to insulate energy from geopolitics because it's very well connected. So I don't know, do you think that maybe there's ideology involved in that rejection or that denial of the geopolitics of energy by professional economists, at least.
I think that's a very good way of putting it. I hadn't thought about it quite in those terms before. I mean, I think that the difficulty of finding a way of theorizing energy is part of the avoidance of it. And I think that geopolitics and the geopolitical dimension of that is quite probably central to the difficulties of theorizing it. I think it would also, just in itself, involve economists having to take politics more seriously than they're inclined to do. I think the other thing that's true to Andre is that I think in a way the policymakers themselves, from the at least from the 90s and perhaps the latter part of the 80s and into then the very early 2000s, and in fact I'd say in European countries longer than that actually, they also in a way adopted a market mindset, an economist mindset to the energy question. And this idea, which I think is sort of there in quite a lot of the way the Commission talked about energy questions like in the 90s, that actually you could avoid it being a geopolitical problem by just applying market principles. And this goes back then to the question like Miguel, asked, because if then that turn in the US and Britain is actually energy is quite central to that turn towards the markets, then you start thinking that markets can solve any problem to do with energy in the way in which that, well, let the prices go up, let's incentivize more supply. That took care of the problem. Let's not try and do anything that's more restrictive in terms of production, restrictive in who can buy what. Let's create unified markets across the whole of the European Union for energy. And then we could say that what the last, maybe it's only 5-6 years, I don't really know when I'd want to say that energy shocks really started penetrating, geopolitical energy shocks really started penetrating through European policymakers' minds, but they certainly have now, I would say, in the last, I think they probably did before last year, to be honest, but it is that there's been a recognition amongst policymakers as well that actually you're not going to get very far by thinking about energy simply as a problem that markets are going to take care of for you, and that it isn't possible to leave the geopolitics out of it. And I think part of that, I mean, the thing I think that Western policymakers have had to realise, and when they started realising, I say is open to question, is that China absolutely never went down the road. The Chinese leadership never went down the road of thinking that this was an economic problem in that sense, or a problem that markets could deal with. They understood it almost like hyper-consciously as a political problem, right from the point in which, well, I was going to say right from the point in which China stopped being self-sufficient in oil, but they saw that coming. And you could argue that the very fact that China under Mao created an oil industry in the 1950s came about because once the US embargoed selling oil to China after the revolution, that China had to come up with solutions, and the market isn't going to take care of it when you're under geopolitical embargo.
Okay. Some more questions? Nobody? Okay, so okay, Pablo, then I will ask something.
Yeah, it's I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity to ask another question, and it's partly related to what Andres was saying before, and it's the interdisciplinary challenge. I think when you, so I was wondering, when you set yourself to write a book such as this one that combines insights from different disciplines, how did you envisage the methodological challenges of combining political science, political economy, You also, at the beginning of your talk, you said that you don't consider yourself an economist, but you definitely engage with economists in your own talk, in your own work. So how do you deal with the issues of interdisciplinarity we write in this book? And I also maybe from a practical perspective, because I can imagine that from the perspective of colleagues and editors, sometimes they frown upon these type of projects, that they say, oh, but it's not enough politics, or it's not enough economy. Finding the right balance is not easy. I can also imagine the historians were not an easy crowd either. So I was also wondering how you dealt with these issues, because it's practical aspects of it is also not negligible, I would argue.
Yeah. I mean, I think I always started from the thought that as an organizing principle of what I wanted to do, it would have to be historical. And I mean by that I was going to write like chronological narrative. Now, obviously, it's very big picture. I'm going through a lot. That I think there's a couple of things I actually did look up a couple of like archival sources about when I was being driven by my curiosity to try and understand something. So I did actually spend some time, and I might even put a few references into it, looking at the some of the archival stuff on the Suez Crisis. But obviously, most of the book is not written like using archival sources as a historian would. And I knew that I was opening myself up and writing about as many different bits of history as I was to someone telling me you just got that completely wrong. And I just had to accept that I was trying to get it as right as I could from my understanding, and be open to someone telling me you're just wrong about that. And I mean, at a certain point, you either have to like just take that risk or not do it. But I wanted to use historical chronology as my structuring like principle, and then I would bring in terms of my thinking before I started writing, like just what in my judgment was like necessary to tell the story at any particular point. And if that meant like me reading a set of history books for a week, that's what I did. If it meant me reading political economy literature for a week, that's what I did. If I meant really going to like international relations journals, or reading geopolitics, I don't think slightly at times sits outside, like the international relations academic discipline, that's what I did. So I just went trying to understand. I just let what I was trying to understand at any particular point drive what I would read, and be as Catholic as I could about it without having, like a closed mind of shutting down like any roots, if you see what I mean in that respect. In terms of dealing with the editors and things, I mean, this was in one sense like made simpler, in one sense made more difficult by the fact that I was trying to get a trade contract, either with a commercial publisher like Penguin, or as I did with one of the academic presses that do trade. And in the end, the options I had, I chose Oxford University Press. And then that means that you are basically dealing with academics, providing initial peer review on it, and they obviously have a set of concerns. And then you're dealing with an editor who is very good in my case, whose concern is just like, how does this come over to the general reader? Because if it's going to sell for the publisher on the trade side, it's got to be readable. And then that is a tension, because sometimes that there are things that you might explain in greater nuance, complexity if you were writing it for a straightforward academic book, and you can't go into that in quite the same way if you're expecting non-academic readers to pay for it and then read it. So that was always a question like that I was like wrestling with, of trying to make sure that it was as clear as I could make it without oversimplifying, and certainly not doing anything that was distorting of what I thought was the causal story that I was trying to tell. And then in a way, I just think that I was, in one sense, tragically lucky, because of the fact that the book came out on the day of Putin's invasion. Then I didn't really have to do a lot of work to persuade anybody that energy was central to geopolitics. And because I had got a story about Ukraine in the third chapter of the geopolitical section, which made Ukraine a fairly pivotal fault line in the post-Cold War world, I wasn't predicting. I haven't got a prediction that that's the kind of war that, but I have obviously got something to say about that. I think that gave me some credibility and made it easier, really, for people to understand what I was arguing. And even things that I thought would be difficult, like my interpretation of the Suez crisis. I remember when I was writing it thinking, this could cause me some difficulties. I wasn't think I was wrong, but I could just see that it would seem potentially an unusual interpretation of the Suez crisis. But actually, because of the circumstances in which the book came out, when I was first doing like podcasts about it, everybody wanted to talk to me about the Suez crisis. So in that sense, I think that events actually just, as I say, there's something very bad about that as well, because of the nature of the big event that happened. Just gave me a space to talk about a book like this that I don't think would have existed for the reasons that you're saying, like Pablo, without the events of the world. Or at least I think it would have been a lot harder for me.
Okay, thank you. Is there any more questions? Are there? No? Okay, so then I think I'm going to take the chance for make the last one and for closing this last seminar of this year. And I was thinking about your book, because I really like how you merge macro politics, geopolitics, energy, and the idea of create a coherent narrative merging all this stuff. So I'm a sucker for long durée approaches to issues. So I think historians should go back to do history that way. But I think a question on your methodology to do that, which is basically, what is the room for individual agency or political agency in that big picture? Because I understand perfectly that in the book you have to focus on the topic and don't develop so much these things. But in your conception of how academics should engage or should address these big political historical issues, what is the room for political agency or even individual agency? Because reading your book, it seems to me that energy is a very good example that political agency has a room there, because climate change policies is a clear triumph of political citizens organized electorally. And so they managed to change approaches, great economic approaches to this stuff on energy. So I thinking on that. And then a more specific question connected with the landscape you draw from the last years in taking into account energy. What do you think is the impact of the shale gas boom in the USA in the portray of the energy situation in the last years? So that's all. Thank you.
Well, I think this agency question is obviously important, and I think in the democracy part of the book, I tried to show in a number of cases where the political contingency of who was holding office and the political judgments that they made were like really consequential, and that things did not have to turn out necessarily in the way in which that they in the ways in which that they did. I think where energy is concerned, I still think that it is important to think about it and not to deny its importance. And I've not spent, obviously, for the way that I was writing the book, there wasn't space to like go into this in any way. But I've been working with a colleague in the Free University of Berlin on a paper on German-Russian energy relationship, and we've been like wrestling with the question about how to like write about the Nazi period. And I think that this is difficult but perhaps necessary example to think through how we shouldn't be too energy determinist, that you can situate the Nazi response to Germany's energy situation in a long history of the 20th century, both actually before the Nazi period and after the Nazi period, in which Germany had no domestic oil and also lost very early on in the 20th century the imperial competition for controlling those parts of the world, obviously particularly the Middle East where there was oil. It lost to Britain and France. And I don't actually think that you can detach Germany's early moves on the energy transition from the ongoing awareness in the German political elite of Germany's problems in this respect. But I don't think you can then read off that okay, the way in which the Nazis and Hitler dealt with that is then determined by Germany's historically long-standing like energy predicament. Someone other than Hitler leading the Nazis would not have made the decisions that Hitler made in dealing with that. Not because Hitler wasn't obsessed by energy, he actually was apocalyptically obsessed by energy. But that's precisely the point where his agency did matter, and that you can't just run from this is the historical predicament, this is what any German leader will do in the face of that historical predicament. I mean, if you put it really schematically, you would say that it's the same predicament. You can trade with Russia, you can try and conquer Russia, and then trying to conquer, you can do it as they attempted in 1918 without annihilation of the populations, or you can do it with, or historically it was done with annihilation. And so it's not determinant. I mean, the predicament remains the same, but the way in which the leaders actually deal with it, we need to take individuals, and certainly groups of individuals at the top, and their mindsets seriously in order to do so. And now, Carlos, I've managed to forget in saying that. I have to always sort of think hard when I use this, when I say things about Germany and Nazis. So just remind me about what the second question is.
The second question is about your opinion on the shale gas boom.
Oh, that's it. Yeah. I actually had that, and I realized that after it was too late to go back, because I started on about how disruptive in the Middle East, particularly in relation to Saudi Arabia, shale oil was. But what I intended to say was that shale gas was very, very disruptive for Russia-Europe relations. It was as big a blow, if not more, perhaps, to Russia, or at least as much to Russia as shale oil was to Saudi Arabia. And it essentially meant that Russia had a competitor for European markets in the way that it had gas markets, in the way it hadn't of any particular consequence before. And then in that sense, I think it recreated the competition between America and Russia over European markets around oil at the beginning of the 20th century. And crucially, within the European Union, it then divided the European Union because there were the states, obviously like Poland and the Baltics, for whom American liquid natural gas was a lifeline. I think it was a Polish foreign minister who said when the first gas arrived from the United States that Poland was getting its sovereignty back again. And then a country like Germany that was like, we're quite happy with the way things are, you know, and we won't be building any liquid natural gas ports, let alone buying any of your gas. And then I think it really complicated the whole Nord Stream question, because it meant that the Germans heard the arguments the Americans made about Ukraine's security in terms of the commercial interests of American LNG companies. I think it also probably delayed for till around now some of Russia's development of the Arctic gas, in part because it had in its earlier plans in the 2000s imagined that it might be able to sell gas to the United States from the Arctic, and obviously a world in which the United States was domestically self-sufficient in gas, the American market was not going to exist for Russia. I think what we can see now, though, is that Russia is adjusting both to US shale and to the end of, or the much reduced pipeline gas into Europe by basically getting itself into liquid natural gas more, and to using the Arctic and the Great Northern Sea route, the Great Northern route through the Arctic, that is now possible because of climate change, and that it has a way through LNG and the Arctic of really focusing on the Asian gas market, and that it can compensate for the loss of the European market, even though if you'd said to Putin at the beginning of the 2010s that will be the upshot of it all, I think it would have absolutely horrified him, because shale horrified him enough without the idea he was going to lose this competition. But I think the Asian and LNG turn are well underway now.
Okay, so thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure, Carlos, and you all. Thank you.
For us, it's been fantastic to have someone like you with us. And for closing this academic session, we hope to have such a fantastic guest for the next year. And thank you all for having attended the seminar. I remind you that this seminar will be uploaded in our YouTube channel. Okay, we have a last question. Miguel, we have just very few minutes, okay? Okay. Miguel, do you want to ask something?
I don't know, sorry, I think I just mistake. I was wondering to have a reaction for this fantastic topic. So I think just I mistaken the button, but I take the option to congratulate the speaker, because I'm not really focused on these chronologies, but I think that it has been a really useful and wonderful topic. So thank you for it.
Thank you.
So let's get
Thanks a lot.
And thank you so much, Professor Helen Thompson. I hope everybody can read your book, as some of us have done, and enjoy it as us. So this is the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye. Bye.
Okay. So vamos a ver si nos quedamos. A ver, un momento, que quería hablar contigo, Miguel Ángel, y con Pablo, si no se ha ido. Pablo se ha ido ya. Bueno, pues ahora le llamaré. Vale. Bueno, tenemos aquí... vale, estamos nosotros, o sea que está Ana Catalina también por ahí, pero bueno, nada, que ya...
Sí.
Sí, bueno, y está Ana que le he dicho que se conectara.
Sí,
Ya está.
para que hubiera más gente. Y Daniel.
Eso es, pero ahora creo que se ha ido todo el mundo. Pero bueno, nada, da igual, porque quería hablar con... Ah, no. Bueno, quería hablar con Pablo y contigo del año que viene. Ya le dije a Ana Catarina,
Sí.
Ana Catarina, ¿nos estás escuchando? No, yo creo que no, se le vivió a algún lado.
Sí.
Vale, bueno,
Oye,
pues
que si
nada.
quieres cerramos y hablaremos en
Y
otro momento.
ya hablamos en otro momento, no te preocupes. Que nada, era para hablar del seminario, o sea que ya está,
Vale,
sin
vale.
más, ¿vale?
Hasta luego.
Bueno, pues yo creo que ha ido bien y nada, ya te llamo mañana un momento, aunque sea.
Vale, hemos tenido 16 personas.
Sí, ha habido momentos de 16 y 17, bueno, yo creo que no está mal para cómo estaba la cosa.
Está bien, está bien. Está
Así
bien.
que,
Y ella ha estado bien, siendo un tema que se nos iba, ¿no? A la mayoría o al perfil de los que solemos estar, ¿no? Con el gas y con el petróleo. Pero la verdad es que esa capacidad de visión global, lo que decíais, está muy bien.
yo creo que por lo menos una cosa de estas cada año por escuchar algo un poco distinto e interesante está bien, aunque requiere esfuerzo y más en inglés.
Sí, sí.
Pero
Bueno, pero ha habido buenas respuestas, es verdad.
sí, además
Bueno,
que no conocía nada. Bueno, Miguel, mira Ángel, pues eso, que te llamo
vale,
mañana un momento y hablamos, ¿vale?
vale, muy bien.
Chao, chao. Adiós.
Venga, hasta luego.